All right, let's say that you've done the diagnostic work. You understand that the creativity to implementation gap in your organization is not a motivation problem, it's a structural one. You know that psychological safety is being undermined by your donor accountability system, that your incentive structures reward the appearance of success over honest learning, and that community voice enters your design process too late to actually shape it. You understand the problem. So now what? So this is the moment where most practitioner advice fails people. It either stays at the level of principle, shift power to communities, or build a learning culture, tolerate failure, without saying what that actually looks like on a Tuesday afternoon with a grant report due. Or it hands you a methodology without telling you which structural conditions have to be in place before the methodology can actually work. So this video is a very different kind of video. It's not about diagnosing what's broken. It's about the sequence of moves grounded in what the research actually shows works that practitioners can use to build genuine innovation capacity from inside the organizations they already work in with the constraints they actually have. So here's the approach most organizations take when they decide to get serious about innovation. They add something. A new process, a new role, a new initiative, an innovation lab, a design thinking curriculum or workshop, a learning agenda tacked onto the program budget. The instinct makes sense here. If we're not yet innovative, we need more of the thing that produces innovation, right? But the research points to a different diagnosis and it changes the prescription entirely. The organizations that have actually built genuine innovation capacity didn't do it primarily by adding things. They did it by changing things, specifically the operating conditions that determine what gets rewarded, what gets reported, and who gets to define the problem in the first place. That distinction matters a lot for how you spend your time and your organization's resources, because tools deployed in a structurally hostile environment don't produce innovation. They produce a brief surge of energy, followed by a quiet return to business as usual. And the practitioner who has watched that cycle happen 3 times in 5 years doesn't need another tool. They need a different starting point. But before getting into what to do, it's worth grounding the recommendations in what the research shows actually works, because what works in innovation is more specific than the sector's general enthusiasm for the concept tends to suggest. USAID's Collaborating, Learning, and Adapting framework, the most thoroughly documented attempt to institutionalize adaptive learning inside a large development organization, achieved its results through 3 structural commitments that most organizations treat as aspirational rather than mandatory. Dedicated budget lines that funded staff positions specifically for managing feedback loops. A combination of top-down mandate and bottom-up ownership that embedded learning across organizational levels, not just in a dedicated team, and codification into the actual program cycle. Activity design, procurement, and evaluation before programs began. Not as a recovery tool when things went wrong. The CLA evidence is instructive precisely because it shows that adaptive learning at scale isn't a cultural shift. It's an engineering problem. You build the infrastructure for it deliberately, or it just doesn't happen. The frugal innovation research adds a different kind of evidence, one that comes from watching communities rather than organizations. What it consistently finds is that the innovations most likely to be adopted, sustained, and genuinely useful are the ones that start from accurate problem definition. An accurate problem definition happens most reliably when the people who live inside the problem are the ones who define it, not as consultants to an externally led design process, but as a genuine co-designer with authority to shape what gets built. The enabling condition is not a methodology, it's a power relationship. And the organizational psychology meta-analysis covering nearly 20,000 participants across organizational types is clear that psychological safety is not built through workshops or value statements. It's built through management behavior, specifically whether leaders visibly model the vulnerability they're asking of others, and whether the organizational systems that govern performance, promotion, and reporting send consistent signals that honest accounting of failure is safe. There's an honest tension to name here before the recommendations, because pretending it doesn't exist would make the practical advice feel easier than it actually is. Most of what genuinely builds innovation capacity requires changing something that already exists: an incentive structure, an accountability relationship, a decision-making process, a funding model. It doesn't layer on top. And that means the first real question is not what tool should we try, but what conversations are we ready to have with donors, with boards, with leadership, with the organizational identity that has been built around the language of innovation without yet doing its structural work. The research is honest about this. Most organizations are not ready to have all of these conversations at once, and that's okay, as long as you're clear-eyed about what you can and can't change within your current constraints, because the alternative, adding innovation tools to an environment that isn't ready for them, doesn't just fail, it consumes credibility, it exhausts people who care about learning, and makes the next genuine attempt even harder. So the recommendations that follow are sequenced deliberately, from what most organizations can do within existing constraints toward what requires more fundamental renegotiation. Start where you can, name honestly where the structural limits are, and use that naming as a lever for the harder conversations rather than as permission to stop there. So here's the frame I would offer for thinking about all of this. Building genuine innovation capacity is less like launching a new initiative and more like preparing soil. The seed, the creative idea, the promising pilot, the insight from a community already exist in most organizations. What determines whether it grows is whether the conditions around it can support it. Enough light, enough water, enough space, the right nutrients in the ground. Add the seed to unprepared soil and it doesn't matter how good the seed is, it won't grow. The metaphor matters practically because it tells you where to put your energy first. Before the next workshop, before the next lab, before the next innovation hire, ask honestly whether the soil is ready, whether the incentive structures, the accountability relationships, the learning routines, and the community power dynamics in your organization could actually support something new, growing to scale. If they can't, the most valuable thing you can do is work on those conditions. And if they can, even partially, that's where the tool becomes useful. So here's the reframe that shapes every recommendation that follows. The question is not how do we innovate, it's what does our organization need to change to make the innovations we're already generating survivable? That's what the practitioner's real question should get to. And the answer is always a sequence. Conditions first, then tools, then scale. Organizations that reverse this sequence, tools first, hoping that conditions follow, keep getting the same result and wondering why. So here's what that sequence actually looks like in practice. These are not separate things to do, they're a progression, each one creating the conditions the next one meets. The first move is definitional. It's more powerful than it actually sounds. Create an honest internal vocabulary that distinguishes between creative ideas still being explored, a tested adaptation with some preliminary evidence, and then a validated innovation with demonstrated outcomes. Before your organization calls anything an innovation publicly, ask which of these three things it actually is. Stop presenting category 1 as category 3 in donor reports and strategy documents. This single shift begins to reorient the culture because it makes an honest assessment feel more legitimate than optimistic framing. and it protects the credibility you'll need when you ask for the harder structural changes later. Now from there, do the operating model audit before anything else. 4 questions, answered honestly. Do your incentive structure reward learning, or do they only reward hitting predefined targets? Do you have a genuine portfolio approach to your programs, where some are explicitly expected to generate learning rather than results, so that the honest accounting of what didn't work is built in from the start? Do staff have protected non-negotiable time for genuine reflection, or does it get squeezed out every time program delivery gets busy? And do you have any system for capturing what you've been learning from failures and routing it to the people who can act on it? Or does that knowledge disappear when the project closes and the team moves on? If the audit reveals a hostile operating environment, and it usually does, address those conditions before adding any innovation initiative. Tools in hostile environments produce theater. Once you have a clear picture of the operating conditions, build psychological safety as a management practice rather than a culture aspiration. 3 concrete moves here. First, have senior leadership publicly share examples of their own mistakes and what they learned. Not in a performative way, but in a specific, detailed way that makes clear, honest accounting is safe. Second, institutionalize retrospectives after every significant project phase, where the genuine question is what didn't work and why. Run in an environment where the answer carries no professional risk. Third, if your organization works across cultural contexts, track whether different teams experience this differently. The research found that significantly stronger effects of psychological safety are in Western organizational cultures than in others, which means that what feels safe at headquarters may not translate to field offices. Then move to the donor relationship, which is where the hardest conversation usually lives. 2 things most organizations can do within existing constraints. Propose learning briefs alongside, not instead of. Standard donor reporting, a short structured document that asks what was tested, what was learned, and what changed as a result. Modest burden, but it begins to establish learning as a reportable activity and build adaptation protocols into proposal designs from the start. Framed not as a permission to change what you're doing, but as a systematic feedback mechanism that protect donor investment. If genuine renegotiation isn't possible with your current funders, name that honestly internally and identify a separate, more flexible funding stream, philanthropic, unrestricted, or internal, to protect your experimentation from the pressure of restricted grants. And then the community question, which the evidence suggests matters most and gets addressed last most often. Map where community voice actually enters your design and decision-making process, not where it's consulted, where it has authority to change or stop a design. If the honest answer is that community input can refine your solution, but not really redirect it, your innovation model is organizationally centered, regardless of the language around it. Moving toward genuine community co-design means giving communities decision-making authority, not advisory roles, which requires the organization to be genuinely comfortable with solutions it didn't really originate. That's a significant shift, but it's also where most durable innovations consistently come from. Now, the field question I want to leave you with cuts across all of this. Of the 4 conditions, incentive structure, psychological safety, donor accountability, and community power, which one is your organization most ready to change right now? And what's the smallest structural move you could make in the next maybe 90 days that could shift that condition even slightly? This is not just a question, write it down, because the practitioners who make progress on genuine innovation capacity don't usually do it by waiting for the right moment to transform everything at once. They do it by defining and finding that one structural thing that they can move, moving it and then building from that and naming honestly what they can't yet change. So now let's bring it all together. Building genuine innovation capacity in the social impact sector is a structural project, not a cultural one. The conditions that allow innovations to survive, from the operating model that governs how staff spend their time, to the management behavior that determines whether people feel safe naming failure, to the donor relationships that define what can and can't be reported, to the power dynamics that determine whether communities shape designs or merely respond to them. All of this have to change before the tools can work. Adding the tools first is how organizations produce innovation theater: visible, energizing, and ultimately costly. The sequence the evidence supports is conditions first, then tools, then scale. Start with the honest audit of what your operating environment actually rewards. Build psychological safety through management behavior, not initiatives. Negotiate what you can with donors and protect your experimentation from what you can't. And move toward genuine community co-design, not as a principle, but as a structural commitment to who holds decision-making authority in your programs. Now, none of this is fast. The most documented success case in this space is USAID's CLA framework, and that took years of sustained leadership commitment, of explicit budget allocation, and then codification into procurement guidance before it even reached the field at scale. But organizations that have built these conditions don't just produce better innovations. They produce the kind of organizational culture where people stay long enough and trust each other enough to keep learning, which in a sector defined by problems that resist easy solutions is the most durable form impact capacity there is. The Learning Loop Guide is designed to support exactly this kind of structured, ongoing organizational reflection, helping teams build the habits that innovation capacity actually requires, one cycle at a time. The link is in the description, free download. And if you're in the middle of trying to build this inside your organization right now, what's moving and what won't, I generally love to hear in the comments. This is Beyond Social Science, where we focus on practical learning for global change makers. If you learned something new today, I'll see you in the next video.